we go.
Perfect. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome participants observing as well. And thank you so much for being willing to add an hour to this meeting and your next two meetings. We've got a lot to cover in 3 hours. I hope you have lots of coffee with you, because I think you'll notice that in the meeting packet, there was a lot of new information. There was a lot of evolved thinking. There are a lot of decisions that ideally we want to move toward in this meeting, not making any final decisions today because you do have 2 additional meetings, but sort of move the ball down the road so that we can start to get a feel for what this final set of recommendations is going to look like. Tom, if you want to pull a couple of the video. Never mind, got it. Okay, I think we're all that I'm seeing are committee members. Just helps clean up my screen. So just a really quick review before I turn it over to Tom and Amanda to see if you have any opening remarks that you'd like to make at all. But we will be ending on time at noon. Thank you for arriving right at the start. The assumption is that you've read the whole meeting packet, so we'll be talking about every item in that packet, but we won't be reviewing it. We'll just be discussing and getting your reactions to it. We need
Jody,
your full...
quick question.
Please.
There was a question in the chat from a public member about are the meeting materials posted?
Yes, thank you. Tom, if you could post again the website for, we have a page on the Maine Climate Council's website, and all materials are always posted there. So we'll get that up in just a moment. Hannah, it shows you in the waiting room as well as in person, but here we go. I don't know. Okay. Essentially, we're trying to adopt a problem-solving orientation here so that we're clear on what your proclivities are toward many of the issues being brought up today. We're ideally trying to work toward consensus, and note that this meeting is being recorded, and all comments are on the record. Mm-hmm. So Amanda and Tom, do you have anything that you'd like to start out with before we do a quick review of the agenda and I turn it over to opening remarks from Hannah?
Thanks, Jody. Nothing specific for me, just thanks to everyone for joining. Looking forward to this conversation today.
Great.
Yes, and I'll just echo what Tom said. I know we've got a lot of work ahead of us, so I think we should just dive into it. Just an apology from everybody. I'm having some technology issues with my laptop all of a sudden, so I'm on the phone until I can work that out, but hopefully I'll be able to join you on camera soon.
Great. So until that link goes up into the chat, anyone listening and looking for the meeting materials, if you could go on to the GOPIF website, Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, there's a Maine Climate Council webpage. On there, there is a tab for the Forest Carbon Task Force, and all meeting materials are found there, past and present. So, this is the opportunity today to become more familiar with conversations that have been happening at the regional level and to start thinking about how those can square with what work you've been doing to date, and how do we make those sort of compatible and be able to build off of one another. So Hannah Pingree, Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, has been kind enough to join us this morning to offer some opening remarks about that. And then Claire Johns from the U.S. Climate Alliance is also here to walk through a slide presentation, and then we'll be opening up for questions and comments to just think about all of that, of alignment. Once we do that, you'll be moving into, you'll recall that you asked Alec and Karen and Barry to sort of flesh out this idea of what it might mean to have an RFP or some equally effective mechanism help to advance your work. So a lot of information in your packet about that. After a break, you'll see that there was a redrafting of a potential outline structure of a final set of recommendations. And so I want to continue to move that more toward a final stage, obviously incorporating a lot of details after this meeting, but getting your general feedback about that is going to be important. You will recall that in the email cover to your meeting packet, I mentioned that Tom Doak and Alec and Tom Abello and Mark Berry may have the opportunity to meet after that packet went out and evolve their thinking even further about potential modifications to the open space current use taxation program. They did that. And so Tom Doak will have the opportunity to update you even further and then get your feedback on that. And then, as you know, half of this group is in a subgroup to think about the numeric goal question that's embedded in the executive order. So Adam will be presenting on that. We'll be getting your feedback on that. Doing a quick review again of the executive order to see if we're missing anything, and then move into public comment. Any questions about what we're doing today before I hand it over to Hannah? Okay, great. So Hannah, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jody, and members of the task force. It is exciting to see you all slogging away. And I was reading some of your past minutes last night, and I know that this has been a lot of work during a busy time, and I really especially appreciate Tom and Amanda continuing to lead this work with everything else they have going on. I want to be very brief because I really want to pass it off to Claire Johns, who has joined us. I believe she's in California, so I just want to give her special props to what it means to be on a Zoom call from California at 9 in the morning in Maine. So, and I really mostly want to just provide context for her presentation. So obviously, you are all very aware of the special opportunity that I think and the governor believes Maine has. We have a vast forest land that is really the highlight of this task force. And I think one of Maine's opportunities, as we saw in the Climate Council process, which many of you participated in, was how do we best make use of our forests and maximize use of our forests for carbon sequestration to manage the climate risk of Maine as an opportunity for Maine, to continue to preserve our forests for the ability it adds to our economy and other climate friendly products. So obviously the opportunity is huge. And I think Maine has the opportunity over the coming years to really go big in this and provide a model that will be especially helpful to other states. I will just say that our work on this clearly is grounded in the Climate Council process and goals and outcomes that were laid out. But I will also say that the governor's executive order number 10, which is not the one that you've been focused on, but it is the one that she announced at the United Nations in September of 2019, specifically calls for the state to be carbon neutral no later than 2045, which is one of the most aggressive carbon neutrality pledges in the country. And I would say that tasked our office, as well as many of the other offices represented on this call, to advance the sequestration of carbon emissions in the state of Maine and grow the clean energy economy. That started Stacy on her incredibly heavy lifting work with Ivan and others to also develop a framework for counting and tracking progress on greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon sequestration, to try to meet this pledge. So I will say that sort of kicked off our work. And obviously we now have spent the last couple of years engaged as a part of the Climate Council process with the leadership of the Natural Working Lands Group, but also engaged with other states. So when the governor first took office, she joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a coalition of 25 states who had committed to continuing to meet the Paris goals when President Trump pulled the United States out. And I will say it has been a group that I have found incredibly impressive, insightful, and really provided leadership on a national level on climate issues when they were not happening in Washington, D.C. And we engage with the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's mostly a coalition of governors' offices who have joined the alliance, and the Secretariat really serves the states and the goals of governors and how do we as states achieve our climate goals. Obviously, we have a new federal administration that has taken a very different and exciting turn in engagement on climate issues, including sequestration and forest issues, which I think is really good news. But we kind of embarked, I honestly have forgot the exact timeline, but more than a year ago, a group of states, including Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York, who approached the U.S. Climate Alliance saying, forest sequestration, potential carbon market opportunities could be a huge opportunity for our state, and they will also be important for some of our states to meet their emissions reduction goals and their carbon neutrality goals. And we were having kind of big and broad conversations, included Tom Avello when he had time, but we really asked the Climate Alliance to start to help us think about it in a more comprehensive way. What were the opportunities? What was happening in California, trying to understand California and Quebec's markets, but also the opportunities for us as states to work together. What were our common goals? What was sort of the baseline of understanding that we as states needed to be able to take action either individually or in some coherent way regionally? And we got very lucky in that we were assigned Claire, who is an expert, and her expertise goes well beyond even my ability to sometimes understand it. So I just feel really lucky to have her here today. They have been working on a very significant piece of work for states across the country, and I think that some of the thinking that they have done will certainly be helpful to Maine. It may be helpful to this task force, but it will certainly be helpful to us as we consider whether there are opportunities to work with states regionally in a way that I think could be advantageous to all of us. So I will just pass it off to Claire again. I thank you all for this work. Tom and I are still trying to get the legislature to finish their work so we can get back to refocusing on implementation of the climate action plan. But with that, again, thanks. And Jody, I don't know if you want to introduce Claire anymore, but I again, really appreciate her, all the time she has already put into this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Hannah. And I think I'm understanding that you're staying with us for this presentation and perhaps a little bit further, so that if questions come up around sort of context, you're here for that. So no, let me just turn it right over to you, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, particularly given what time of day it is over there.
Great, no problem. I have my coffee, as you'll see. So thanks so much. I'll just pull up the presentation. Yeah, thanks for having me at your meeting today. And it's been a joy to work with Hannah and other colleagues in Maine, as well as in some of the other states we've been working with on this project over the last month. So I'm really excited to kind of bring the high level results to this group and kind of throw it in your hopper for future discussion and decisions. So Hannah gave a pretty thorough introduction to what this project was. So the Climate Alliance, given our makeup and goal, is really well positioned to help states have discussions with one another, right? To facilitate discussion among states on specific topics related to climate policy, financing, and the like, including on natural working lands or forest carbon sequestration. So she mentioned this, the states came to us and asked if we could fulfill this role, and we said yes. So we initially focused on this group of 4 states that asked for it, and that's how the Climate Alliance kind of works. So we work for the states that are our members. So we kind of worked at the direction of these 4 states on this. So Maine, Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont. We got several questions about, can New Hampshire participate? They definitely could. The alliance isn't, exclusive necessarily to members. They just weren't part of this initial discussion, but obviously represent sort of a donut hole amongst your states geographically. Oops, sorry. So as Hannah mentioned, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont all share some real commonalities, and that you all have very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets, as well as carbon neutrality or net zero targets by mid-century. So I won't go through this chart here necessarily, but you can all see pretty similar greenhouse gas reduction targets by 2050. And then beyond that, these net zero targets, with Maine having the soonest one, which is great. And this use of offsets, or ARM. ARM stands for alternative reduction measures. That's how some states have kind of codified carbon sequestration in legislation. All of these states see forest and agricultural lands, sort of natural climate solutions, or LULUCF in the climate sectoral jargon, as the key to getting to carbon neutrality. So there'll be some emissions left in 2050 or 2045, and we'll rely on carbon sequestration to make up the difference. To be sure, states are also looking at carbon capture and sequestration, so sort of the technical approach, but we focused here in this discussion on carbon sequestration, and really first on forest carbon sequestration. I think the goal is to identify some sort of regional mechanism to increase investment in carbon sequestration writ large that would affect other land types as well, right? So agricultural lands, coastal lands, but to just first focus on carbon, because that's really the biggest land base in these states, and the biggest opportunity just in terms of carbon flux. Another something else in common that all these states have is relatively near-term deadlines for making decisions on this front. So Maine and Vermont both have 2021 deliverables. You, of course, are working on the recommendations to the governor's office. Vermont has their Climate Council's action plan is due at the beginning of December and is supposed to include strategies for natural working lands and carbon sequestration. Massachusetts has kind of passed the most recent legislation in this space, and so they have next year, I think they're going to be coming out with their scoping plan, but their legislation includes very explicitly a focus on carbon sequestration, and their scoping plan is to include a numeric target for carbon sequestration as well as strategies to achieve it. And New York has also been working for some time through their Climate Action Council and a subcommittee focused on ag and forestry on how they're going to use that land base to get to net zero, and recently came out with a suite of proposed strategies that'll be going through their full council and then a scoping plan next year. So all of these states sort of recognize that now is probably the time to put our heads together to start thinking about whether and how some sort of regional initiative might work. And I should add that all of the states are working together in good faith, right, to look for solutions and figure out, what might be done, but there's certainly nothing binding about this discussion, right? It's just a discussion through the Climate Alliance, and the hard work will be when you all go back to your states and try to get it done. So the problem, so all of these states have identified they want to maintain and grow carbon sequestration to meet climate targets and satisfy other public sector needs. So that's an important piece, right? We're not just shifting to looking at forests for their carbon sequestration value. All of these states want to continue the commercial production value of forest, recreational value of forest, sort of forest and ecosystem health writ large. So there's a desire to approach this problem from that kind of multifaceted angle. And no states have the program capacity or internal public funding to do this at the scale implied by greenhouse gas targets, or that's been identified even in existing plans, let alone new ones. So some, I didn't include in the presentation, but some math I did sort of looked at. I'll flip back. If you look at the greenhouse gas reduction targets, that implies there's sort of 15 to 20% of historical emissions that are left over. And Maine is one of the lucky ones. So Maine and Vermont are the two states on this list that will have that forest sequestration left if you just kind of maintain business as usual. whereas New York and Massachusetts fall short. And I should say, actually, the country as a whole will fall short of that 15% sort of remainder is the target. And last but not least, there was a recognition that all states really need the inventory and greenhouse gas projection tools to do quantitative policy planning and to develop cost-effective monitoring tools to track implementation. So lack of a sort of a robust, all-encompassing, accurate and consistent greenhouse gas inventory for land use change in forestry continues to be a problem. And I'll say it in all of the Climate Alliance states and at the federal level as well, that's been recognized. But it becomes particularly obvious when you are indeed looking to set quantitative targets, as I'm sure sounds like you've been working on that too. So you might have some experience on that front. And finally, just to drill down a little bit on what all these states had in common. So all had really shared very similar goals for forest carbon. So on the climate change policy front, the goal is to retain and grow the carbon sinks over time, sort of rely on a conserve, manage and restore sort of hierarchy, if you will, for forests. And in fact, as I've already mentioned, rely on net sequestration to meet greenhouse gas goals. I will say it is a recent development in the last year or so to put those types of statements in legislation, right, or in executive orders so consistently across many states as happening now, which is very exciting. Next, keep forests as forests. So a clear goal is to prevent deforestation or forest conversion. Next, to secure acres under management for resilient long-term carbon sequestration. So we're not just talking about planting the fastest growing trees on the most acres, right? The goal is to really maintain healthy forests going forward, including ones that can withstand climate change itself. And as part of this, there's a real need to develop mechanisms that work for small and medium-sized landowners. So these are the ones that have been left out of carbon offset markets to date, and just because they're small, right, and may not even be managing their forest holdings for near-term commercial or any commercial value right away. Nevertheless, that represents a significant opportunity when you, of course, add it up across states to get increased benefit out of forests. And also to keep commercial timberlands working. So to continue forest harvest in these states and even develop new markets where they're synergistic with carbon sequestration goals. Next, there's interest in adding trees to the landscape for carbon co-benefits. So sort of reforestation of lost acres, so sort of marginal agricultural lands kind of comes up quite a bit in this discussion. As well as urban forestry, so planting more trees in urbanized areas. Voluntary forest management decisions need to be economically sustainable as well, right? So this is going to be key consideration in any policy. Implementation should align with existing and emerging national targets, programs, rules, and regulations. So this is a particular interest now when the Biden administration is so interested in moving forward and is sort of put land use into the foreground of that discussion. So we at the Climate Alliance are all running to keep up with kind of developments in Washington and relying on some of our NGO partners to help with that. But what we've been hearing more and more from the administration is that we'd really like to hear more about the specifics of how states are approaching this, because that's going to inform how we approach it. So that's an exciting opportunity for a leadership state like Maine to really help inform the national discussion, not just through the Climate Alliance, but in Washington. And last but not least, getting to scale is imperative. So it's fine to just plunk away here and there if we can, but this group was really looking at, okay, what are kind of the big picture things or programs that would really help us get to scale. And what are the benefits of a regional approach? I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because this group surely knows the forest industry in the region inside and out. But in this area, as well as many others, forest management decisions are already linked by product markets and infrastructure, as well as interconnected population shifts. There was quite a bit of discussion of folks moving from New York and Boston into Maine and Vermont, and what that's doing to land use. And of course, you all share more or less common ecoregional considerations related to forest type, habitat protection, and forest stressors that would impact management decisions. A regional approach could also support a more robust carbon market if that's something that is pursued, by broadening the pool of participants on both the demand and supply size. So typically bigger markets with more participants are more efficient, right? And that harmonizing rules would really help ease participation by the private sector. Of course, there's potential to build on related regional government structures or management structures that already exist, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Forest Service region, the USDA region. So you're already set up, right, to work together. A regional collaboration would likely improve the cost effectiveness of forest carbon and forest health monitoring. Right now in each state, and again, this is not limited to Maine and the other 3 states in this discussion, but given the sort of lack of the desired forest carbon inventory and projections at the federal level, each state is kind of figuring out how to do that on their own. And how that's done and how carbon accounting is done really makes a difference if you're starting to talk about how states are in some ways kind of sharing their mid-century net zero goals amongst one another. So there's likely real benefit to working together, given some of the new satellite monitoring tools and the like. Your states are small enough that you could share LiDAR runs and the like to improve data there. And then, last but not least, certainly not least, is that any kind of regional approach still has to work for each individual state participating in it. So enabling mechanisms, we're really just talking about kind of implementation here. So this is just a kind of a list of contents of what we'll go through. So I'll skip through this. So what are the traditional mechanisms for increasing carbon sequestration in forest landscapes? So these are programs that you have in Maine and many other states have. So, support for conservation easements through grants or tax credits, promoting climate smart practice implementation, again, through grants, technical assistance, permit streamlining, maybe a combination of all of those. The state can provide consultation and other technical assistance to put forest management or stewardship plans in place. Many states do that through tax incentives. States can, this is a little bit different, right, enable use of carbon offsets for greenhouse gas reduction compliance obligations. So this is certainly a policy decision to be made, but this is, for example, what's been done in California, right, where the regulatory body for the greenhouse gas emission reduction regulations has said regulated entities, so factories and smokestacks and the like, can use offsets for a limited percentage of their compliance obligations each year. And that is what has driven investment in the offset market, because there's a very real value in the regulatory structure there. And then, of course, there are always other policy and regulations to work with: timber harvest rules, land use and zoning regulations, tax policy, quite a few tools you could use there. This is probably not an exhaustive list, right? But try to identify kind of the big buckets. And next, we spent quite a bit of time in the group talking about offset markets, because that's to date has been one, if not maybe the sole mechanism for investing in forests for the clear benefit of carbon sequestration. So we kind of reviewed recent updates. So California, there were important new rules that went into effect this year. They've kind of been longstanding in legislation that passed a few years ago, but they have resulted in significant restrictions on the quantity of offsets that can be used for compliance. So I just talked about what a great mechanism that system is, the amount of offsets that can be used for compliance this year is half of what it was last year. And use of out-of-state offsets was limited to 50%. So do the math, and use of out-of-state offsets for compliance purposes is up to 25% this year, what it was in the past year. So this has had the result of kind of pushing the existing offset projects, because remember, they're kicking off new offsets every year as trees grow. They're pushing those offsets into sale on the voluntary markets, not necessarily losing value from what we're hearing from some anecdotes, but not used within the regulatory system. Quebec has its forest protocol under development right now. Quebec has a market and regulatory system that's linked to California's. I think it kind of remains a question, given this out-of-state use, whether and how offsets produced in Quebec would be used in California. But folks in Quebec want to use their own forests for compliance in Quebec, right? So that's what they're working on with their forest protocol. RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the price remains below the floor that would trigger use of offsets for compliance. So there's basically the regulations say prices have to be a minimum of X. I want to say it's $12. It might have gone up a bit. And that's prices in the RGGI auction, periodically. And that auction has never hit that floor that would allow offsets to be used for compliance. So that system is somewhat dormant for now and maybe in the near future. And then a lot of action in voluntary markets. So prices have gone up for natural climate solutions based offsets, and NCS offsets remain the most valuable type in voluntary markets. The price is still about a third or a quarter of what California offsets are getting. And these are, of course, kind of global numbers, but nevertheless, a big discount. Corporate net zero commitments are really fueling a proliferation of offset protocols. Some of them even kind of designed just to work for specific big companies with big demand. But that is very much expected to increase US demand, and some folks in the markets kind of see that as boosting offset prices in the voluntary market. So maybe why those California offsets aren't losing value even when sold into the voluntary markets. And then there's quite a bit of interest at the federal level in the Biden administration, and it's, I think, been a longstanding interest at USDA to promote voluntary participation in offset markets and voluntary actions to increase carbon sequestration on the land base. So this definitely showed up in the USDA's 90-day progress report on climate smart agriculture. There is very clear unified NGO and industry support for voluntary action. There's something called the Food and Agricultural Climate Alliance that is working on this, not related to our climate alliance, but we're in touch. And there's been some interest in a carbon bank at USDA. So even exactly what that means at the federal level is unknown. There have been some pilot ideas kicked out. Maybe it would be a price guarantee, but I think this is sort of a wait and see for now. And then just the fact that the Biden administration is open to action on climate and is pursuing forest and agricultural carbon sequestration as part of that has really put new life into bills that have kind of gone up and then not been voted on in the last couple of years. So the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which actually passed the Senate recently, and the Rural Forest Market Act are just two. What can the state role be in the carbon market? I'll kind of skim through this because I know I'm running out of time. So a state can do, there are kind of two buckets of activities. A state can create demand or lower costs of participation. So state can create demand by making offsets eligible for compliance purposes, as we've mentioned. A state could buy offsets, so that's public sector procurement. And I think the same concept of government as sort of a market maker and driving markets in a direction of public benefit, that would have the same role in the offset space. And a state can, of course, provide funding or technical assistance to help develop the voluntary markets. Sorry about that. And next, states can lower cost to suppliers. So help with technical assistance, fund development of analytical tools, support activities that complement offset generation, right? So maybe help continue to support forest land conservation, which may be a component of an offset. And the state could also, kind of a different angle is to sell offsets on state land. So there are a couple states within the Climate Alliance that are pursuing this as sort of a learn by doing approach to offsets. There remain hurdles to offset markets, again, which many of you are, I'm sure, are familiar with. They have high transaction costs and just don't work for small to medium-sized landowners. That's been the case to date, really, unless you're 5,000 or 8,000 acres or more, it just hasn't paid to engage in offset markets. Some of the protocols are just too restrictive for some landowners, especially at current prices, so they don't want to give up the ability to change management decisions over time, which is what current offset protocols, for the most part, require. There is a steep learning curve and administrative costs if a state is to take on and administer a program. And last but not least, there's real public concern about use of offsets, I guess, as taking pressure off the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and industrial emissions, which I think states have tried their best, including Maine, to satisfy by saying, we're focusing on emission reductions first and then looking at offsets as part of our net zero commitments. And also there's concern that if offsets are used, then each year a little bit less than expected pollution will be reduced. And so that, of course, has some impacts on air quality and public health. So it really, I think behooves states as well, the federal government as well, to really consider how these programs can be designed to address those needs. So critically, so next steps for these states. So right now, all of the other states in this group of 4 are doing kind of what you're doing now, which is to go back to their task forces or committees or whatever it's called in each state and sort of bring back the results of our conversations and consult with this group and others on next steps. And really the goal is of this group, if it were to continue into kind of a phase 2, would be to focus on, how can a regional collaboration increase investment beyond what each state can achieve on its own. So that'll be really the driver there. I list here, and I think it was in your memo as well that you should have received or that were posted. There's common interest in kind of a few key outcomes. So potentially adopting standardized or compatible LULUCF inventory and accounting methods, identifying a common mechanism of exchange for forest carbon sequestration benefits in the region. And maybe that's offsets, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a new kind of offset. And then scoping the necessary infrastructure for a common carbon offset program, if that's a desired route. And rule adoption, again, to reiterate what I said at the beginning, would really be at the discretion of each state. And yeah, so we're looking now, each state is doing, again, kind of this internal consultation and a public consultation with stakeholders. And then we're looking again at sort of the next sort of 12-month period and would be carving out a work plan that would cover those 12 months. Again, really driven by states' timelines. That's it. I went a few minutes over, so apologize for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm thinking maybe if you could maybe stop screen sharing, but just have that next step slide available if the group is wanting to turn back to it so that we could pop that back up. But that's great. Thank you so much. And I think what I might suggest for the group is if you want to turn to your meeting packet, pages 3 through 5 were the memo that Claire prepared for this group. And on page 5 is, at the bottom of page 5 is sort of a summary of next steps. And that last slide that she presented is sort of, some of the more meat, the meat that would potentially be the next step. So let me open it up to questions from any of you. and reactions to conversations that have had so far, and reactions to the proposed next step. So all three items, questions or comments. Go and just raise your hand. Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the materials and the presentation, and it's really wonderful to see the good discussions ongoing. Just a very quick question. Was there any discussion of funding for forest easements? That is something that it was recognized generally in your slides and materials, the importance of holding on to the forests. I just wondered if there was any discussion of that.
Yes, I'd say we identify that as something that's needed, but we didn't get into state specific policy, and each state funds their forest easement programs a little bit differently. Of course, all states have the forest legacy program in common. So I think one, and I would say that the Alliance is working on this outside of this kind of just group of four as well, but communicating things like, you know, we need to maintain and potentially increase funding for the forest legacy program would be a message, would be one message, right, to bring to Washington. And I'm sure every other state in the Alliance would agree there.
And if I could add, I think there's growing interest in eligible land trusts being able to hold forest legacy easements. And
Yeah.
the trust is working on that with other states and groups. The more that could be done to increase the funding and flexibility for forest conservation in these federal programs would help every single state meet its goals.
Thank you, Karen. Other clarifying questions as to what the conversations have been over the past many months? Go ahead, Patrick.
Can't find I'm out of practice. I can't find my hand raising button. I think, Claire, this is really interesting. A lot of this we've been discussing, but I think Maine is kind of unique to the other states in the grouping that you've talked about. And I always worry about kind of a homogenized approach. We're going to be, what are we, 90% private, and we have about half of those acres in industrial ownership. So to have a government-driven process is something we're always concerned about. And we have, you know, those 8.5 million acres are kind of doing their own thing with regard to understanding what the markets are. They're large landowners, and so I think I just raised that caution, and I don't know what your thoughts are about. Have you dealt with the industry and with involving private landowners in some of your planning, or do you simply leave that to the states to figure out?
We left it to the states in this process. We just did the easy stuff where it didn't involve a ton of outreach, right? Because I think the goal was just to kind of educate ourselves about potential opportunities and obstacles in a small group first, and then kind of bring it back to others for discussion. I have some experience with working with industrial landowners in California myself from previous work. But yeah, I think you're right, that large commercial landowners and small family forest landowners are not the same, you know, don't necessarily have the same management decisions for their land. I think that's where and I don't want to default to carbon offsets, but if carbon offsets were to be of interest across the states, it would sort of come down to the offset protocol design, which is it's the formula for an offset, right? It's how you quantify carbon sequestration for use in a given purpose. So I think the desire would be to add, create or adopt protocols that would serve, multiple different types of landowners.
Other questions. I'm keeping track of time. We don't want to get off schedule too early in this meeting, given everything else that we want to cover. We do want to make sure that we identify or surface any major confusion, questions, or concerns around conversations that are happening at the regional level, because I think the slide that Claire put up that really focuses on getting to scale being imperative and wanting to make sure that what's been happening as a parallel process, a logically parallel process, ultimately shifts to an integrated process, because this committee will expire after a couple of months and conversations will continue beyond that. So flagging any other concerns or aspirations to both Hannah and Claire is going to be very helpful moving forward. So anything else for comment before we wrap up this agenda item? Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I know you want to move on.
No,
This
no.
would be helpful if, at some point we could get a sense if there's some states that are really pressing ahead with specific ideas that might benefit this committee. I know the material you presented had to be somewhat general, but while we're here, while we're doing this work, if they're really interesting ideas or you're seeing energy around at any particular state level that is worthwhile, we appreciate, I know I'd appreciate learning about it. So.
Yeah, I'd say these states, and I should add that Jen Phillips from the Climate Alliance is also on. So if you know of others, please feel free to jump in, Jen. I think among these states, it's earlier stage in terms of thinking about approaches, including, the highest, not highest level, but including like the foundational question of, are we going to allow offsets to be used for compliance? And if so, how? And gosh, how are we going to fund the existing programs we have, let alone scale them up? So I think everyone's sort of at the same position. You do have states like California that has had an offsets program running for over 10 years now. So I think there's for sure some lessons learned from that program that would be interesting to states. And I tried to kind of daylight those for the group as we went along. But I'll keep that in mind. And it's one of the benefits of working with the Climate Alliance, right, is we get to kind of keep tabs on what a lot of the leading states are doing on this front.
And Jen,
can I just jump in? I mean, Claire has far more expertise, but I would actually say this is kind of a burgeoning and new area where a lot of states are grappling with it together. And frankly, the role of the Climate Alliance has been to take these states who have a similar understanding and recognize the importance of preserving sequestration. And we're trying to make sure that we're at least kind of thinking about these issues in an apples to apples kind of way in terms of the data and the quantification, which is probably going to be important. And then we also have a federal government who, even Biden's new announcement includes certainly recognition of these issues. So it's sort of, we're at a very high altitude. I feel like we're all approaching this together, and not saying every state will take a similar approach, but we're trying to at least understand it in a similar way, which frankly is a new, seemingly somewhat new, except for California. So, and I think for the importance of this task force, I think really thinking about Maine, Maine, I think we're very different from many other states, and we have potentially opportunities here. So I think that's why the work of this task force to kind of help us as a state. I think we have an important federal delegation, and these issues are certainly coming up in federal climate legislation. So I actually think Maine has an important role to play in the work, and the thinking that we do about it this summer actually is impactful. So again, we're trying to understand it nationally and state by state, because if we don't think about it in somewhat similar terms, it's going to be a total mess. But obviously, I think Maine has a unique role, and even a unique role, somewhat unique role in the region. So again, that's, I think, the role of this group.
Awesome. All right, well then I think we will pivot. Thank you so much, both to you, Hannah, and to you, Claire, for being with us today, for presenting new information, for staying in touch after today, and continuing the work over the course of the summer. So, big breath, and let's move on to the work that Alec and Barry and Karen put in between the last meeting and this one to flesh out. You'll recall that Alec floated in very general terms this idea of possibly having one of the recommendations come out of this group to have the governor's office or the Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry issue an RFP. And they've spent a fair amount of work on this. You've seen a lot of the content in your packet, and just want to give all three of them the opportunity to provide some brief opening remarks before we have a substantive discussion about that. So whatever order you'd like to take it in, the three of you.
Well, why don't I kick it off? So just to say, thank you for the opportunity to consider this issue and how we move forward in a way that could really move the needle in terms of carbon storage. We all know that forests already play a huge role in Maine and New England and globally in storing a lot of the carbon in the terrestrial ecosystems. However, we're cognizant of the fact that not only do we need to maintain current levels of carbon storage, but there's an opportunity to really increase them, and by doing so, to make a big difference for climate. The opportunity in Maine forests writ large, this is not for the small landowners solely, but rather for the state's forests as a whole, is huge. As Patrick is working on issues like expanding existing production, there are also new products that are being developed, like the wood-based insulation, and we can combine that with proper silviculture. We can at the same time increase storage as well as maintain harvest. And the analysis that we've done suggests that this would be equivalent to taking 1 million cars off the road for a century. It's huge. And that's about a third of what New England needs to do, not just Maine, needs to do to fill the gap that exists between what we're doing already and what's needed to get to net zero. So we've approached this from the perspective of the task force was set up to make a difference and suggest to the governor ways that we could make a dent as big as possible in greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. So that brings us to this proposal, and this is a recommendation to the task force, and it's about tapping the creative energy of others, not just ourselves, on how to capture the potential Maine's forests to both store more carbon while maintaining harvest levels, so we can maintain our forest products industry and the carbon that's stored in products. This, in my view, could really move the needle, make a significant difference if we get the kind of creative proposals that I expect that we would, and seems like a step very, very worthwhile to pursue. And let me just end by saying that this really was a team effort. And Karen and Barry and Tracy Moskowitz were all very much involved in putting this together. And at this juncture, I'd like to ask Barry and Karen to give their thoughts on this issue.
Do you want to go first, Karen, or should I?
She's saying you, Barry.
Okay.
You
Okay,
go, Barry.
Okay, I would definitely echo everything that Alex said. It was definitely a group effort and went through several iterations to get to the point of the information that you have now. And the proposal really does, as he said, tap into the creativity of the people. And I would say it's more than just the creativity, it's the business drive of the numerous companies who are already deeply invested in this business. So it's a way of not just the creativity, but the business drive and getting that energy and all those thought processes coming into something that might work really well for the state of Maine. And that kind of takes the onus off DACF and the Maine Forest Service to come up with such a program. It kind of frees these organizations to continue to focus on being a referral service and a clearinghouse and expanding capacity for all the programs that will come forth as part of this. And I think if DACF and Maine Forest Service can do that well, that will be a great thing. And having an RFP and having other companies develop a program for us, it'll be a kind of a symbiotic thing. And if you've read through the RFP, basically Maine can accept more than one proposal or none, depending on what we get. There may be some proposal that works well for larger landowner classes or different types of landowners. So there's not going to be a one size fits all we're not envisioning a one size fits all for this, for sure. And just listening to the report this morning and the information we have about the goal of the U.S. Climate Alliance, there's a lot of parallel. The goals that we saw on page 3 of our PDF and also Claire's slide number 4 are very much in line with everything we've been talking about in this organization. So I think that's important. And one of the big goals of this is basically increasing stocking and in our forests overall as a more effective means of sequestering carbon. And of course, decreasing the loss of forest land is really important as well. But numbers wise, and this is something I've learned in this whole process, that really if we can increase the value and stocking of our forests, that's really where the bang for the buck is going to be. And I think that this proposal also has the potential to significantly increase the numbers of different landowners to reach the landowners and the number of acres to really impact both carbon sequestration and management of the land, which is a beneficial thing for a lot of things and not just carbon. And again, the bottom line of all this and all these proposals is maintaining the harvest level, just switching from maybe some of the past practices to more carbon friendly practices, but still maintaining the harvest level. So I guess I'll stop with that and give Karen a turn.
Thanks, Alec and Barry, and hello, everyone. I agreed to be on this subgroup because I was finding myself kind of between two places in my and how we might really achieve some significant goals as a task force. I was aware that there are a number of startup programs that we had been learning about that are pilot, that are in different parts of the country, but really weren't tested necessarily and tried. The programs that are more tested and successful appear to be mostly available for the larger landowners. And that, that sense of fairness of trying to come up with something that would be available for this acreage size landowner just seemed to be so important for Maine, for what we have here, so many acres, so many landowners in this category. And the thought of, having DACF design its own program did seem very challenging. I remember when I was serving on the Natural Working Lands group, and I brought in a very humble proposal, and Pat, you were so kind. You said, Karen, that's a noble effort, which was so sweet of you. But, it's an enormous thing for just to create something in this task force, or, completely push it over to DACF. And so the power of this is, as both Alec and Barry has mentioned, is to tap into the sophistication and the creative energy and the business drive of existing entities that are in this field, and to see what they might come up with using our work, our standards, our practices, and the boundaries that we want, the sideboards of making sure we don't change the volume of the harvest, but to change the management in a way that sequesters more carbon. I also want to recognize that we've been hearing from the public that from this category of landowners that they do need funds to be able to pay for some of the important kinds of forestry that will help achieve these goals, and that they want to work with loggers to do so. And so finding some mechanism, not just property tax reductions, but incentives that are financial to do this, and to have pre-commercial funding and other practices that are going to really be beneficial to this goal, requires money. And so this, to me, seemed a way that we might move in that direction without having to figure it all out ourselves. So I appreciated working on this with folks, and hope we can move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. Let's just open it up. I think we need to have a really, substantive conversation about this, so it's clear by the end of the meeting sort of how each of you is feeling about it. Who would like to start? Would it be easier if I called on each of you? Happy to do that too. Go ahead, Pat.
I was trying to give others a chance here, but I appreciate all the effort. I had several thoughts. I mean, to me, I'm trying to, there's pieces in this that seem to relate to Maine's forest as a whole. And for instance, the graph shows this tremendous opportunity, but that's going to be on lands that are managed now, are probably industrial lands, I would say, because you've got stocking levels that you could theoretically improve dramatically, and we need to look at those numbers and assumptions. So that, and when I think of the size class group that we're talking about, it's going to have, I think the problem with that size group in general is that it's overstocked land. And so we're trying to make it healthier and bring more management to that land. That's really kind of, we have a harvest to growth ratio that's in excess of the harvest by quite a bit. So I think that's one issue. So when we say we're maintaining harvest levels, I think in some of these, in general, if we look at some of these southern areas, we're talking about increasing harvest levels to to both sink more carbon and to get a healthier forest. The other, it's not clear to me if this is a dividend program that's being described, because it looks that way. It's not certainly a volunteer program. It'd be a state dividend, a state endorsed dividend type program, and that's a big challenge. But I'll stop there for now.
I'm noting Melissa and Tom, but I think maybe in this conversation, it might be helpful to have a little bit of a back and forth to see whether Alec and Karen and Barry have any responses, maybe not after everybody's comment, but any thoughts that you want to provide to add clarification to issues that Patrick raised, any three of you, before I take Melissa?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I don't think the word dividend really came up in our conversations, and I'm not really sure how that would apply here. We're looking at really more of a way to efficiently and economically aggregate small landowners. As Claire mentioned in her presentation, I think we all kind of know that it's a bottom, the current status is it's a bottom line, at least, 3,000 or 5,000 acres for a landowner to be able to tap into carbon markets. And I think a goal of what we're looking at here, which is, I think, quite compatible with what's going on regional level, is how to aggregate and engage these lands. So I'll just stop there.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you want to add, Karen or Alec, on that?
I'll jump in if Karen doesn't want to. Karen, do you want to go? No? Okay. So I think that Pat's comment about the stalking on small landowners in central and southern Maine is correct. And we've done work that shows even if you have very heavily stocked stands, it appears that it's possible to manage those in a way which is climate beneficial within 30 years. We've done a preliminary analysis in that regard. And part of what that can do is to help provide the wood that we need the forest products industry to have in order to stay healthy, while you're at the same time increasing the stocking on other lands. And with regard to a dividend program, I'm not sure I even understand what that is, but Barry's right. We never really we're familiar with that terminology. I mean, this is open-ended, the way that we've laid it out in these materials. The program could be designed in any one of a number of different ways. And the idea here is, let's get the creative juices flowing among those other parties and have them make proposals to us for how this would work best to reach as many landowners as possible and to increase carbon stored in the forest as much as possible, while at the same time maintaining harvest.
Great, thank you. Let me take Melissa and then Tom and then Dana in that order, maybe having some responses in between. But at the same time, let me just point you all to Adam's comment in the chat about information on page 26 of your packet that talks about not all land in this size category being well or overstocked. Melissa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I enjoyed reading through the suggestions, and my only thought was that I like how it's open-ended. I like how it involves other companies and businesses that have knowledge based right out of the gate. In the evaluation process section, it mentions it's composed of qualified reviewers. And then it also talks about how the state has the right to choose or not to choose. And I'm just wondering, are all of the reviewers going to be part of Department of Forestry, Agriculture, or are they going to be composed of other scientists and people in addition to this group? Or
I won't bounce it back to them, but I think I'm just going to note that as a question, that if this concept advanced, that would be a question that would need to be resolved. So thank you. Tom, go ahead.
I was trying to get other people to go first too. I'm pretty skeptical of a state running a program like this. I don't think I would. I think I'd be much more supportive if I didn't see the efforts that are underway by from very creative people in the private sector doing this. And we are working with 4 different companies now on lands that we own to try to do these, to test these systems against it, including, just a few parcels. So I think that will develop it. I think you have to keep in mind that any system you have, if you develop another system, now you're competing against the 4 others. So the landowners are going to go where they get the best deal. So now you're going to have to, you're committing the state to a 30-year ongoing commitment to, I think, to run a program of some sort and get it accepted in the marketplace, but then have to adjust as you need to compete. So I'm a little skeptical, not that this idea is needed, but that this is the best place to be doing it and the best place for the resources of the state to be put as far as helping these landowners, particularly the smaller landowners, qualify and get into a carbon market. So I'll leave it.
Could I offer one comment in response, Jody?
Please.
That is, the materials make it clear that one of the things that we're looking for as the desired program is that it pays for itself. Okay, that it's not a drain on state coffers. So if you look at, I think it's Appendix G, but I don't have it right in front of me. It includes that as part of a desirable program that it does pay for itself. It pays for the person who's running the program, which may not be state government, and it pays for any state costs that are created.
You're going to have to make an awful lot. You're going to have to make an awful lot of assumptions about how many people are going to participate when you build a system, because you're competing against these other systems who, if that's a better deal, they're going to go over to that other system. So the state's going to have to be, any of these systems are going to have to evolve pretty quickly, or they'll just be left out of the market, I think. I think this is a really great emerging area. I'm pretty confident that we're going to have a bunch of different options for landowners in the near term. And I don't know that the state is the right place to be doing this.
Got it. Karen, go ahead to reply.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just say that, we certainly have been thinking of those kind of factors, Tom. And 2 or 3 points we tried to emphasize is that Maine Forest Service would continue to be a point of contact for landowners to inform about any evolving programs that are available for that class of acreage. That the state, here is really able to provide something that would be hard for any one sort of organization, which is an aggregation kind of concept, because of the knowledge that people have of the Maine Forest Service, the relationships, the trust, the fact that the state continues. Some of these programs may not continue, they may not work. And so to have that stability, name recognition, brand is something we might want to try to leverage here. So those were the thoughts and how we designed this.
Thank you, Karen.
I'd like to add something
ahead,
too,
Terry.
if I may. Tom, you mentioned something about a 30-year time period, and I don't remember that we have anything like that in any of our discussions or written materials. It sounds like what Maine Woodland Owners is doing is similar, very similar in a lot of ways to what we're proposing here. You're talking with different carbon companies and trying to figure out a plan for MWO. And so what we're talking about, I think, is maybe just the same thing on a grander scale. So I think there's definitely opportunities for cooperation here. And I think probably the 4 companies that you're in discussion with, if they thought, well, maybe this isn't just people who are MWO members now. This might be for all landowners of less than 10,000 acres in the state of Maine. That would, I would think, ramp up their interest and involvement perhaps. And it could also be a good thing for MWO, because I don't know what the current numbers are, but the percentage of small landowners in Maine who are actually members of MWO is historically always been surprisingly small. So I think this might be a good way to boost membership in Maine Wood Landowners Association. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Dana, go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. So first, I want to commend the group. You know, Alex said something in his opening, and I think that's where we need to focus. And I don't see this as being prescriptive. I think we are all doing the best we can in a very short period of time to put ideas on the table, but we're also up against a deadline and we have to produce a report. I don't think in the time that we have allotted, we're going to come up with a one size fits all. So I don't look at this as being prescriptive. I think you've thrown a lot of great ideas on the table. There may be other ideas that can be put on something like this, but I guess I agree with what Alex said. This is a way to bring the best ideas to the table, and maybe there's something out there we're not thinking of, but I think some process has to take place to solicit ideas from others that we're not thinking of. And I don't look at this as that the group has put forth a prescriptive idea that the state is going to run a program. I don't think the state should run a program. I am in complete agreement that this needs to be voluntary. I think the state could have a role and should have some role, whether it's technical assistance, whether it's getting some funding out of this to provide better or greater, more holistic services. It could provide funding to the contractors, which I think is desperately needed. The state of New York has a program that pays contractors to employ certain services. So I think, again, there are ideas that would come about through some process that we could then reflect upon. And I think that's what, frankly, we need. Aggregation is key. I've had conversations recently with Forest Carbon Works and with Finite Carbon, and they're all trying to solicit their programs as being better. But what they haven't thought about is how you aggregate within a certain area. And to me, a voluntary program that might be run like a forest group certification program within a regional area that's aggregated, that economy of scale means a lot. And if we could push someone in the marketplace to develop something like this, but the state has a role in technical assistance or aggregation, I think there's something there. But I totally agree with what Tom and Patrick have said, that the state should not run the program. We have an aggregation program already with Efficiency Maine Trust through the RGGI program. I'm not saying that is a perfect alignment, but we already have something like it. It doesn't have to look the same, but it could provide some funding for desperately needed technical assistance, contractor needs, et cetera, with the state. That said, I think this is an inclusive approach. I think we need to get better ideas, and we need to solicit from those outside of the state who might have better ideas than us. And then let's spitball it and see where we land. But I don't think this weds us to anything. That's the way I look at it.
Thank you, Dana. So I'm just going to note that we haven't heard yet from Ryan, Stacy, Tom, Abello, Amanda, Ivan, Adam. And I think it could be good to get voices, all voices on this. Ivan, go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. And I did a better job of hanging back than Tom did. So I'll provide some comment now. I agree with a lot of what's just been said. I think the subgroup deserves a great credit for putting together quite a detailed sort of mock-up of an RFP and the thinking that went into it. I don't think we should confuse the New England analyses and the great work that Neff and others do with what our discussions have been focused on, which is in Maine, 10 to 10,000 acres. And so Pat brought up the the graphic, which is important from a regional standpoint, but it's much more encompassing than the specific focus of our task group. And therefore, we want to be clear on what's the potential for the 10 to 10,000 acre landowners in Maine, and what kind of program should we put forth. Tom, I just want to emphasize what Tom said, that if this was done in one form or another, it would not be my understanding of what's being proposed. It would not be a mandate, but it would be an effort to present some hopefully creative strategic thinking for the state, for all of us to consider. I realize we won't exist after 2 months, but for the state to consider. I think the work, I would argue that better ideas is not necessarily appropriate, because I think this group's come up with great ideas, but on a short timeline with a deliverable due in September. I would think whatever this effort is, whether it's an RFP or a call, or I don't have enough bandwidth to describe or to evaluate the mechanism, but a mechanism that calls for this kind of strategic thinking and proposals seems like a logical next step. I think some of the some of the recommendations coming from out of this work relative to open space and investments in technical assistance, and et cetera, are all positive and will make Maine's forests healthier and more resilient if we're successful. But it does feel like there's an opportunity now to take it to the next level. Can we do more within this sector? And of course, as part of the regional initiative, which Clara's great presentation gave us some context on. The language that is in the sort of mock RFP here, I think is, again, really well done. It points to concerns for leakage and additionality. Those really need to be emphasized in an RFP or a call, so that programs proposed could demonstrate clearly that they would achieve those goals, and could demonstrate that they were achieving those goals. The other aspect is there needs to be more emphasis on timelines. Carbon sequestration in 2025 is way more important than carbon sequestration in 2045. And as these programs succeed, even the regional discussions, rhetorical for the moment, but was going to ask Clara, have there been discussions about what happens in this region over the long haul? So as programs are successful, then 30 and 40 years from now, we have more fully stocked forests that essentially need to be maintained forever. Because if we stop high levels of management and investment, that carbon, of course, can come pouring back out. So by and large, I think this is a well-conceived recommendation to move forward beyond where we will end up and the good work this task force has done in September. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan. And I was responding to a text, so I didn't see the order in which Ryan, Stacy, and Tom raised their hands. Whichever one of you went first, if you could just jump in, and you probably noticed.
I don't know if it was Tom or myself. I think I might have beaten Stacy as well. I can be real brief. I think from my perspective, the concept of an RFP to solicit broader perspectives and information and proposals from folks that may have different ideas or different concepts or programs is a valuable one. I think I've used that mechanism in several instances, which is really led towards successful selection of an approach. And I don't think, like others have pointed out, that this necessarily weds the state or the effort to one thing or another. I think you can use that as a basis to craft something entirely different if that's the consensus of the reviewers. You can use this information to craft something that we think or the state thinks would meet the goals. So I support the effort and the concept of an RFP.
Thank you, Ryan. Tom, do you want to go next, and then Stacy?
Sure. Thanks, Jody. Yeah, I agree with a lot as what's been said already. I just note a couple pieces. That there will be some administrative, sort of procurement hurdles if and when something like this would move forward. I know that Amanda has thought a lot about that, and will likely want to say something on those two pieces there. There will also be some kind of a legislative effort to create the instrument if this was to move forward. I think that would be an important role too. As far as the substance goes, I like, as I've said to all three of the folks that presented, that I like a lot of what's in that document. I go back to, one of our original points was keeping forests as forest and preventing conversion. And that's really why we're focused on this small to medium landowner cohort. And there's a range of interest level, there's a range of engagement within that cohort for their own property. There are some people that are members of Tom Shop that are really engaged and are focused on regular management and a whole variety of management on the ground. And then there are folks that are holding land but don't really know what to do with it. And that's why I think this is potentially one opportunity to reach some of those, but not all of those people. And so I think it's likely one tool in a broader toolbox for preventing conversion and for maintaining forest as forest, because this is where the conversion, in my mind, this is where the development will be. And so I guess I would be interested in, because this is a kind of evolving space and evolving market and multiple groups, I wonder about taking at least a kind of a smaller bite to start some kind of a pilot where maybe it's focused on a particular county or it's something along those lines where we can test certain things and then gauge the level of the state, what kind of commitment the state would have to bring to that in terms of staff resources, additional technical assistance, all those things. And as the market, or if the market changes where there are other groups coming on board that have better ideas, or if this regional effort really gathers steam, we can change horses midstream because we're focused more on the pilot and testing phase.
Thank you, Tom. Stacy, go ahead.
So I just want to echo what others have said in that I think what's been drafted is really well thought out. The priorities are very clear. The concerns are very clear. In reading this, preparing for the meeting, my first thought though was, is this necessary at all with all of those other programs that we've recently learned about? Before joining this group, I didn't realize that there were already programs targeting small woodlot owners. And they sound pretty good. And so my initial thought was, let's just wait and see how those play out. Maybe those are sufficient, and do we really need to muddy the waters? But in listening to comments today, I've changed my mind, which is why I was quiet, because I was kind of on the fence. And I do think that what this RFP can do is really highlight and encourage people to look at what might be missing from those other programs. And I think that is important. We don't know everything. This is certainly not my area of expertise. And maybe there are some people out there with very creative ideas that we haven't considered. By no means does putting out an RFP commit us to taking on another program, but we can gather some more ideas, which I think is important. I do, though, think we want to see how those other programs play out. And I think we need to be careful about having any sort of state-sponsored program. I think what Karen said with, if a program is kind of sponsored by the state, it gives it credibility, which is good, but it also potentially takes away an opportunity from someone in the private sector, which I think is an issue, and we need to be careful about that. I like the idea of soliciting
more ideas to see what we can do so that we're not just stalling to see how these other programs play out, that we are actively trying to make sure we're doing everything that we can do. But I really do still like the idea of the state working as an education resource to promote awareness and make sure that people know about all of these other programs. And then if we add another program, great, that's another option. But I think, yeah, being a source of outreach and education is sort of what I think is the priority.
Thank you. Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've been hanging back and listening to just because if people recall, I think at the last meeting we talked about this. I've just been wondering if an RFP is the best vehicle. You know, I'm hearing a lot of support for the idea, and so definitely we're open to talking more about that. I think I just want to flag that from a logistical perspective. When we put forth the recommendations from this group, that's later this year. And then, as Tom said, there would probably be some kind of legislative action. And, I do want to flag that I don't feel like we have the existing capacity right now within MFS to do this in a way that we would want it to be done. An RFP process actually is quite work intensive. It's not a quick and easy kind of a process doing something like this through the state. And then we also want to make sure we have the capacity to really thoroughly follow up on any proposals and have the follow-up conversations and really dig in and think about implementation if there's something there. So I just want to flag that there is a capacity question in my mind, and that we would need to address through our recommendations process, and we would need to be successful through some legislative process in meeting that need. And then getting to the point of putting out an RFP and getting the responses, and we're talking about well into next year in terms of timeline, which by then we may know more, as we've talked about. There's a lot happening, there's a lot that's developing, there are a lot of creative and innovative discussions going on. So don't totally know what the world will look like when we would get to that point. But I think having some flexibility built into, if this is the recommendation, just having some flexibility around, what the vehicle is at that point in time and what the process is at that point in time would probably be helpful for us versus trying to be too prescriptive and then, just being in the world at that point in time and not knowing if it's going to be the right thing to move forward, or if something else will have come to us by then and we all feel like that's the right way to go.
Great, thank you. Karen and then Tom. Joke.
Thanks. And I just wanted to maybe clarify two things that have emerged during this, and these are great comments. Just to emphasize that our group, in trying to put out some ideas, always envision this as totally voluntary. So there was one comment that made me think that perhaps people didn't realize that. And maybe to your point, Stacy, when I said state sponsored, I meant it's the state having an RFP. The role of the state is, as you read the materials, is something that the respondents can brainstorm about. Whether, how and if the state is involved is something that is part of this inquiry. So I know some have commented about the concern that this be a state-run program, and we were not saying that it needed to be or should be, but that the state is sponsoring this request for proposals. So there's so much flexibility in this concept. And then the final point, and I just throw this out as a question to all of you, we are going to be ending in a couple months. I think as you did, Stacy, is the learning here of a number of different pilot programs out there gave me pause. So how long do we wait? How do we know what's real and how, what's really going to capture a huge number of smaller landowners in Maine? we wait 2 years? How do we test it? Whatever. And so what I thought a bit about in trying to work on this subgroup is this is a bridge concept here. And it will, be a way to then tap what probably is hardening off, hopefully, next year, if we're in a year, out there. And it can actually perhaps mobilize, influence, and accelerate some of that in terms of that thinking. So again, trying to think about, poof, we go away, and then do we just wait for a while? And how do we know, and how does the state take the work of this group and really move forward with engaging a lot more landowners? So, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So let me take Tom because you have your hand up, and then note that we haven't heard from Adam or Don. If either one of you wants to comment, now would be the time. And then after that, I'm going to try to summarize what I'm hearing, and then we're going to go on break. So go ahead, Tom.
Just a couple things. I didn't mean to imply this wasn't voluntary. So if that comment came through, I never have thought of this other than voluntary. So, and I want to be clear, I'm in favor of a system that works for small landowners, and there's definitely a need there. I am just concerned that that we're going to spend the next 2 years working on something. An RFP is going to be obsolete. The way the market's moving, I think an RFP could be obsolete by the time we have it ready. I would rather, and I worry that our resources are going to be put into building some kind of system instead of saying, let's have the state support and be nimble in supporting landowners to meet the needs that they would, to help them into one of the systems that exist, and be flexible and as I say, be nimble enough to okay, this is where this is going. Let's get the resources. Let's get the technical assistance over in this area, or let's get it over here. But that's gonna evolve, and I think someone focused in the Forest Service or somewhere specifically on where these systems are and how they're evolving would be really beneficial. But I'm worried we're going to put resources where they're not going to end up being the most helpful.
Great, thank you, Tom. Patrick, and then Adam.
Oh, I'm on. Okay. Well, if you're going to have an RFP, what I'd recommend is when you look at the general requirements, you don't have a strong statement about financial pro forma. I think it'd be really important to see just how the proposal would work financially, not just, I don't want to be the one trying to figure that out as a reviewer. You want to get a pro forma that shows the ramp up over time and the participation rate and the revenues generated. So I just think it would be really instructive to have a strong pro forma, not just financial analysis recommendation. And then the only thing I want to reserve discussion on is Appendix F, but you might be able to handle that, Jody, when we go into a discussion about our general document.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
I
Thank you.
reference to that. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Adam, go ahead. Then we're going to go on break.
Okay, so just briefly, I commend the group for bringing this forward. I think it's created a ton of discussion. And I think we got to recall too that they use this as a mechanism to try to force us to have deeper conversations and make some decisions by September. I fear that, we're 4 months in and we're still sort of going in circles. It's also easy to say that, well, I don't know, the RFP is going to take a lot of time, and then, it's going to take state resources, but I'm not sure we're coming up with any other ways that we can't come up with a similar excuse that, oh, well, that that's going to require someone else to work with Stacy or Don or Amanda, right? Or, well, we don't know if the Forest Service has capacity. So I guess this isn't it's more of a question that as we go, I think it's almost a segue to the discussing the general document, but how are we going to move any of the ideas that we have forward, where it always seems like we can always come up with an excuse for not putting that forward or not getting it done or not being efficient, right? And I think we got to sit back and say, at least this is a way to try to, and it's an actual mechanism that I think, although albeit we can come up with all the reasons that bureaucracy isn't efficient, it's at least trying to move the ball forward and in a timely manner the best we can. So I'll leave it at that.
I will take I will take issue at the going in the circles. I would say we are on a winding road here and we are moving ahead. Thank you, Adam. Go ahead, Don.
Thank you. I have to defer to the commissioner since she's my boss. So whatever she says overrules whatever I have to say. But I do want to second what Adam just said and Tom Doak's last comments there about timing. And, you know, I would have concerns about any large state-run program. I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Well, so what I think I'm hearing, and you can all just raise your hand immediately if you think that I've heard it wrong, is that I'm hearing more support for the general concept than lack of support. The devil is certainly in the details, that there is a concern around capacity currently to both, you know, administer the RFP, no less, but certainly a reluctance to have the outcome of any RFP process necessarily be a highly complex state-run program. So I'm hearing hesitation about that potential outcome, but otherwise an openness to the idea of moving this concept forward if we figure out the resources to do it and see what we get. I'm happy to listen to the tape again and summarize that more coherently, but as a general summary, is there any major objection to any of you on the task force as to what I heard? Okay. All right. Then with that, we're going to take a break. We're going to move on to the next agenda item. Let's come back at 10. My computer right now says 10:44. So let's come back at 10:50, 6 minutes from now, and pick back up. Let's see. We've got Adam, Dana, Melissa, Pat, Amanda, Barry, Ivan, not yet Alec, Tom, Joe, Tom, Abella, Karen, Brian, Don, Stacy, we're missing, but we're going to get started. So thank you all for coming back. I think what I'm going to ask is for those public participants who are thinking they may want to make a public comment toward the end of the meeting, if you could just hit the raise hand button so I get a general sense of the number of people who may want to speak and make sure that we've allotted sufficient time for that. So you could just, Tom, are folks able to do the raise hand function in this format?
Yes, yes, okay. They should be able to.
Okay, great.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Doug, we can.
Yeah, I have trouble with that hand raising function. I would like to speak at the end.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, good. So if you turn to page 22 in your packet, pages 22 through 7, sorry, was my attempt with limited additional information to start, continue to move this outline for a final report forward. And I was recalling from your last meeting that you did want both of the tables that Don and Adam presented on harvest levels and carbon capturing, carbon sequestration, captured in the final report, final set of recommendations. So those are put in there in and the footnotes on that first table have been corrected. I tried to add some text on the first page that reflected your conversation from your last meeting about the diversity within this landowner group. I added some bullets that are on the top of page 23, or added a bullet, and did some slight wording modifications under the technical assistance and information clearinghouse communications section. Alec, I think, pointed out, or maybe it was Pat, that you wanted to make sure that we circled back to this issue of the best forest management practices. But I think I'm looking for general feedback on the emerging structure of this document and what it might include, and any sort of red flags that it raised for you as you saw new language added to it.
This is Barry. I'll start up. I just wanted to echo Adam's very to the point comment right before our break. And you know, this group has been given a huge task by the governor. It is huge, and we're doing our best on a very limited timeline to come up with a program. And I know that people like Tom and Amanda are the ones, you know, are that when the rubber hits the road, they're going to be having to actually implement and do a lot of this work. And I appreciate that very much, but it's going to take work and it's going to take money to achieve these goals, these ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves as a committee, and also, you know, larger basis as the state. So it's going to take additional resources of people and money, and we as citizens of Maine and also the employees of the DACF are going to have to figure out how to do it. But I think we have to move forward if we're really going to make changes and achieve these high goals that we've set for ourselves. So.
Thank you. Other general comments? Go ahead, Dana.
I appreciate what you put into it, Jody. I think, you know, some of it might be a little presumptuous until again, if we move forward with the RFP or something like it. Some of these are a little prescriptive at this point, and some of them are pending the outcome of that. I don't want to go point by point as to which they are, but if you read down through it, you can get a general sense. So that, I think there's a lot up in the air that some of it should be in here, but not all of it, because it's, again, we're putting the cart before the horse until that RFP process is done. And I'll send you some comments on a couple of the bullets that I think, you know, need some further elaboration, but I'd say that's where I am on it right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Other major, you know, I guess another way to look at this is, are there other major, let's say some that you decide to move ahead with something that looks like either an RFP or an equally effective mechanism to be determined. And so there's reference to that in this document currently. Are there major things that are missing in this document beyond that? So be thinking about that while we take Karen's comment.
Thanks. Just a point I think we had briefly discussed at an earlier meeting, which is just some state agency that's appropriate, keeping both a sense of how much land has been conserved, state and NGO and town and whatever, and continuing to track forest land loss.
Right, okay, I do recall that. I recall the response to that in part being that we've got
There's a registry when you
Registry, but
when
the-
you do an easement, when you buy forest land and put in conservation, but it doesn't necessarily capture all that has been conserved, all that's in state land, I don't believe, and it doesn't show sort of the total. So I don't think it would be very hard to have one state agency be sort of designated as the tracker of this if we have this goal of 30% by 2030. So using that would make sense.
Any concerns about that being added by anybody?
I don't have concerns about it. I think it's a good idea. I think Amanda's shop tracks most of that already. I think the question would be whether the IFW lands are part of that. My guess is that they are, but you know, I think it's a good idea.
Got it. Okay. Other comments? So go ahead, Ivan, and then Tom.
Just two quick comments. I too like the table, and I think the data are important. I think the use or the presentation of the table in whatever this report ends up looking like deserves a bit more narrative of how to interpret it, given the broad public interest in it, since there's obviously lots of variation in range and best guess categories, et cetera. And so how are these data informing our decision making? The other quick comment was the language, it continues to appear. It appeared in the draft RFP, et cetera. Maybe I'm just reading it wrong, but continues to talk about maintaining forests as forest land, et cetera, increasing stocking, while also maintaining current harvest levels. Every time I read that, I think about all the programs I see around me that are seeking to advance forest products and the utilization of forest products. So I wonder how maintaining current harvest levels sort of gels with what I think some would say the goal would be to enhance harvesting levels and the bioproducts. So is that the right language to be using?
Have you as a group always interpreted this the way I have, which was that it was intended to mean at a minimum?
No, I think I've raised the same issue that Ivan does. That it restricts us.
I see it as a floor. Not
Well, if there's any confusion, the language should be clear, because there's a lot of different people with different backgrounds and perspectives that are going to read it. So that was my only comment. What is the intent of that? And let's be clear in doing it. Thanks.
Thank you. Tom, sorry, before I take you, Tom Doak, Tom Abello, do you have any response to what the intention was there in the language in the executive order?
No, I would agree with Ivan. Just to be clear about that.
Okay, Tom, Patrick, do you still have your hand up for a different reason? Okay, go ahead.
I would just recommend that I think we're going to be biased if we look at the chart of 10 to 10,000 acres. I think the number of landowners from 5 to 10,000.
Huh. Okay, we lost him.
You can count. Am I still here?
Can you start over, Patrick? We lost you.
But I am. You can hear me now?
You can.
Okay. I would suggest that the data table, we just have to be careful, because I think the ownerships in 10 to 10,000 range is quite a variety. If you go from, I think we should just test it a little bit. The 5 to 10,000 acre category probably has about 10 landowners in it. So we're making a lot of policy decisions that are going to be skewed, and it'll skew the data too. That's why I'm saying stocking levels in parts of the state are going to be much higher. And I think the other concept here that Ivan touched on is we're talking about silviculture is not necessarily about growing older trees. It's about accelerating the growth of trees. And we keep using terms like extend the harvest cycle to grow larger trees. I think the concept is you can get at it by growing trees faster, no matter what size they are. And as a matter of fact, the industry intends to harvest more. We've lost our harvest levels in the last 5 years. We need to build them back up to where they were. So I think we do have to talk through that concept. And in the list there, I'll provide some comments to get us back to more of a silvicultural understanding of what we're trying to do and match that up to carbon. We've got kind of an open-ended question about establishing forest reserves. We probably need more discussion about that too.
That's discussion that we should have soon. If you have concerns about that, we should probably hear that now, because as you all know, we have next meeting. And then the final meeting is only 2 weeks after that one. So what I might recommend is you elaborate now, Patrick, if you like, and that all of you within 1 week of today provide specific comments, if you have them, about the current draft of this document so that we can continue to move this forward. So I'll come back to you, Patrick, if you like. But let me move on to Tom Doak right at the moment.
Just 2 quick comments. I think that I think the chart on page 22, if I read it right, and maybe Dawn or others or Adam, I think it says that this size ownership owns 37% of the land, but harvests 44% of the wood, or brings 44% of the wood into the marketplace. Is that still saying that? And we've talked about this before, but that doesn't seem to make sense to me. But it's counter to everything that we've ever been told. That maybe we've just been wrong in the past. And then my other comment is I came into this hoping that we would have some very specific recommendations, and so far most of these are fairly generic about, expand or do this or that, but without numbers and things like that. And I'm hoping that the final report would have hopefully some more details to it.
Thank you. Adam, did you want to respond to that or not?
Yep, so that's the best data we have. We've looked at it multiple ways, and that's what it's telling us. So it might be driven by exactly what Patrick raised, that a lot of the harvest is coming in the 5,000 to 10,000 acre group, right? Whereas when we think small lot, small, family forest landowners, which is going to be at the lower end of that category. So I think there are potential issues with the wide range that we were asked to look at, and the data that we have really doesn't allow us to get too much more refined, because there's just not enough plots or info out there at this point. We can always raise that, as as Ivan said, as some caveats, explain the table better, but we can put forward a recommendation that we need to, if people are really concerned about coming up with what are people 10 to 100, 100 to 500, 500, 1,000 plus really doing on their land, then that could be another recommendation along the sides of the data gathering side as we move forward, so that we feel like we have a better idea of what's actually happening on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Dawn, go ahead.
Thank you. I just have a couple of suggestions, and it's based on my reading of the original 2004, I think it was, DEP Climate Action Plan. One is that I think we really need to put a cost on these recommendations and an estimate of the carbon benefits, so that the decision makers down the road can evaluate the relative costs and benefits of each of these recommended actions. Second, I think the recommendations should outline any co-benefits that are associated with implementation of the recommendations, like cleaner air, lower healthcare costs, whatever. Going back to something the Climate Council did, I think we ought to be doing some form of equity analysis on these recommendations to assess who's going to benefit from these implementation of these recommendations across society in Maine. And finally, I think there should be some kind of table that shows how these recommendations would be implemented, whether it's going to require legislation, executive order, rulemaking at the agency level, voluntary measures, regional or federal, and so on.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have Melissa and then Ivan. No, not Ivan, Melissa and Karen.
Yeah, I didn't have any major draft suggestions. I thought everything read well and was what we had discussed. My only comment was sort of echoed Ivan's, was that the chart on 22 needed a little bit more better explanation and a better narrative about how to interpret the data, especially if that's going out to the public. The chart on page 26 also, there's quite a bit of information there, and you know, for the layperson to read that and draw away from it, I think a little bit more narrative explanation would be helpful.
Right, thank you. Karen, go ahead.
Thanks. Again, thinking about the entirety of our meetings and even reference some today, there is this issue of conversion, and I'm remembering some of those early meetings, and Tom Doak, some of the information you presented as this category, especially the more smaller acreages, are approaching later years in their life and intergenerational transfer of land and all. You know, whether there's any reference, if there's any way to capture how these programs, if some of these recommendations move forward, could in fact help keep the forest land in private ownership. So I don't know what that might even look like, but it is a topic that we've bounced against and has come up in our conversations. So I'm just trying to think is what might we be missing here?
Okay. Okay. All right, this is helpful. Any last comments before we move on to talking about the open space program, because you do all need to be updated on that. Pat, go ahead.
Well, Jody, I didn't know how you wanted to handle some of the points I raised on the best forest management practices. I could submit comments.
Right. I mean, are they a dramatic diversion from what's on that page? Maybe you could give the high level perspective so the rest of the group understands what you might be submitting.
Right. I think if I were a legislator reading this, I better start limiting increasing the Forest Practices Act so that we maintain higher and bigger trees on the land. And it looks like we need to establish a bigger forest reserve program. I don't think you can throw those comments out there without putting some qualifiers on them, or thinking about what you're really saying. That's the danger of a report like this. And we're carrying over a bill that says increase forest reserves. How much, what do we have? Those are all important questions. And to what end? Again, Don Mancy has talked about it. What are the trade-offs? And then I think, again, getting back to this extend harvest cycle to grow larger trees is one silvicultural approach. The other is to accelerate growth using pre-commercial methods. And it doesn't matter how you get there. If you grow trees fast, you will sequester more carbon. and get them into products that can be in a sink, as we think. So there's a bit of silviculture that needs to go back into the description here. And I worry about broad statements that have broad policy implications.
So I don't want to belabor this point because we need to move on, but as I am reading this list that you all developed, one isn't prioritized over another. And as I read this list, Pat, I see other bullets within that would be highly supportive of what you just described, of pre-commercial thinnings and commercial thinnings, all things that would increase harvest. So I wasn't reading a particular bullet of establishing forest reserves as being a priority over those other bullets, but that this is a range of practices, all of which could result, each of which could result in increased carbon sequestration. If I'm misunderstanding that, all of you let me know, but I would receive your comments on that within that framework. Go ahead, Alec.
So I would say that it's important to think of this, Pat, as a system. In other words, you can do one thing over here and you can do something else over there. And if on balance, you're increasing carbon stored in the forest and you're at least maintaining harvest, and I would agree with Ivan on the point that he made in that regard, then you have a system that works to accomplish as a whole the objectives that we're talking about. So it doesn't come down to each individual parcel has to do all of these things, but as a universe, they need to accomplish the objectives. If you're not going to have leakage, you're not going to disadvantage the forest products industry, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Tom, Ivan, and then we are going to move on. And Patrick, yes, I definitely, if you could submit your comments for sure in writing.
Jody, I think it might be helpful if we made it clear that these are voluntary practices, that we're not talking any of these into regulatory framework. We're talking about these are activities that we might want to voluntarily encourage landowners to do or something.
Yeah.
We should be clear about, because I think that's what we're doing. So I think at least that.
Okay, thank you. Ivan.
My only 2 cents, and I'm not going to wordsmith on the fly here, is I think the discussion we've just had is appropriate for that list, as is Pat's points, but the introductory bullet to the list should be almost an introductory paragraph to capture what everyone has just said as to what this list really is. They all individually add carbon, but all we say, broadly understood to achieve carbon benefits, is not enough to provide the context in which this list was made. So we need to add that.
Great, perfect. All right, thank you. We do need to move on in the spirit of time. Let me turn this over to Tom, because you have pages 28 through 30, if you could refer to that. There have been, 28 remains the same, 29 and 30, Tom Doak, Tom Gordon, and who am I missing? Mark, thank you. Did convene on July 6th, just 3 days ago, and had some further thinking around this. So Tom, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, so yes, so the original group had Tom Abello and Alec in it too. So, but only Mark and I and Tom were able to make the last one. But we had a good discussion about the role of looking at what we thought the best role for the open space program could be. And it was coming down to a discussion that, taking the pressure off land and keeping land as undeveloped land, that we really ought to look at that in a perhaps a different way. And based on the discussions we had with MMA, I mean, remember these current use taxation programs are administered town by town by town. So the open space is relatively simple as it's currently configured. It's not widely used or perhaps not as effective as it could be, but it's relatively simple. So we were trying to figure out a way to match some of the things we've been hearing. So it comes down to we came out of that last discussion with this idea of looking at the percentages and maybe simplifying it a little bit further and saying things like, if you're in open space instead of 30%, maybe that's not enough. Maybe it should be a reduction, boom, of something else. And the number these numbers are not cast in stone, but just for discussion. If we raise that to 50%. So if you get that, takes some of the pressure off it, because one of the reasons open space isn't used is not enough benefit to people to do it. So we could do that, and then we might have had too much. The original proposal was 40% on carbon. That seemed high for us, because we're trying to say, is this really the best place we're going to get all the carbon benefit? I mean, maybe some credit for some carbon benefit, but we also want to take the pressure off the land base for those that don't want to do the carbon thing or those kind of things. Or so we toyed with the idea of making that a 20%, but then eliminating. We think those kind of changes might eliminate a couple of the existing things, like the management plan part wouldn't, the 10-year management plan wouldn't have to remain necessarily, and the Forever Wild could come out. And then we might be able to simplify the open space program. So I think what we were looking at for is feedback on what people think about raising the level of just pure open space, and then kind of trying to simplify the forest carbon part of it a little bit so that assessors can actually understand it. I guess that would be the quick summary, Jody.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So looking at page 30, you drop that first bullet under number 2. I'm sorry, you increase it to 50%. It's
Right.
currently 30% in the law. And under forest carbon management, you drop it from 40% down to 20%. By doing that, you may, in addition, eliminate the 10-year implementation of a forest carbon practice approved by the Maine Forest Service, that bullet there.
Yeah, or the 10-year the current law talks about if you have a management plan that meets the tree growth standard, you can get an initial reduction. We're thinking probably if you're in the carbon program, you wouldn't necessarily need that. Because you're also getting some benefit in general open space. So we needed to play around with the forest carbon, what would qualify for forest carbon. And that was one of the discussions about, that we really need to, identify what would qualify. But
so let me take, go ahead.
Go ahead. Two of the things that are already in the law, we think we could strike out, which are the management plan requirement, which nobody's using. I mean, the other part of it is, I don't think anybody's using that part. I put that in the statute, but I don't think anybody's using it. So, and then the Forever Wild permanent easement could come out because you're already raising the base up to 50%.
Got it. Alec, go ahead.
So those sound like good ideas to me, because I've always looked at the open space tax law as primarily eliminating the development threat, and I see it as being less about carbon than it is about the development threat. Not to say that there aren't carbon implications from development. There are for sure, but trying to get into complicated things like a management plan along the lines of what was discussed earlier, I think you're better off just to go with increasing the amount that you get for preventing development.
Does anybody disagree with that? Because then we could keep this conversation short and task Tom with modifying this proposal so that it can go out to some municipal folks. So I think I'm seeing Barry and then Karen and then Pat.
Yeah, in my experience with open space and tree growth, I've seen a lot of landowners who had been in tree growth going into open space for various reasons. And especially in islands and coastal lands, that kind of thing. Because of the requirement for managing primarily for commercial forest products. But landowners, if they go to open space, I think it's still a good idea to have a management plan. I guess I wouldn't suggest not deleting that small deduction from the program, because I think it's good overall for landowners to have a plan. It means they're in contact with a forester, and they may not be managing primarily for forest products, but that's usually part of the mix, along with a lot of other things, potentially including carbon. So I wouldn't poo-poo the value of a landowner having a forest management plan for a number of reasons.
Before I take Karen on that, Tom, did you want to respond to that at all?
Well, we should also remember that open space can be any kind of land. It doesn't have to be forested land, and it doesn't have to be 10 acres. It can be any size parcel. It can be open land. It can be all kinds of things. And I don't think this I guess the question is, do you want to, if you're getting a carbon-based practice, you could get a reduction, but just having a management plan, do you want to leave that in there? And would it come out of the carbon, 10% carbon and 10% for a management plan, or those kind of things?
While you all think of that, so Karen, go ahead.
Just, I guess, a clarifying question. So are you suggesting, just so that I'm clear, under the forest carbon management and going from 40 to 20%, that you delete the first bullet and then the forever wild bullet, but keep the implementation of a forest carbon practice approved by Maine Forest Service?
No, I'm sorry. We would take out the forest forever wild one, and then the current one in the statute that talks about 10% if you have a forest management plan that meets the tree growth standard, which isn't on that list.
Okay.
But I wouldn't focus on the actual bullets necessarily, because we really didn't talk about what would qualify. We were just simply saying 20, we need to reduce the amount for forest carbon down to some other smaller number. And then what would qualify, we didn't get to that far into the system. But so I wouldn't focus on what any of those are, but we would need to do a little bit more work on here's what would qualify, here's what wouldn't qualify for the 20%.
Oh, okay. And I guess the thought, whatever happens, having, if there is going to be this carbon component, having some relationship with a practice approved by Maine Forest Service or approved would be good to keep, and also track, what's happening out there. So I
that was the intention. I don't think that was one we were necessarily intending to get rid of. It was
great. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Pat and then Don.
Yeah, I'm always trying to figure out what are we doing to wood supply by these manipulations of tree growth and open space. That's my only concern, and I don't know if I have an answer to that. But has it always been a maximum discount on 95%? And
yeah,
okay,
and it's always been there. Yeah.
And are we going to drive people because of the interest in carbon to go into this program because we haven't made the connection that growing trees also and harvesting them will also help with the carbon? I don't know. It's going to be about marketing, and I guess that's going to be limited. Are we still talking an acreage cap on this?
The acreage cap would remain, as far as we've had no discussion of the acreage cap.
What's the current acreage cap, Tom?
Ownership of 10,000 acres.
Oh, that's where that came from. Okay, well, I'll have to just comment on that. I don't know what to think, but I'm not smart enough to figure out if we're screwing around with wood supply. I know you believe there are people in tree growth that shouldn't be there, but there are also people in tree growth that are stimulated to do a harvest because they're in tree growth. So I don't know where the dividing line is, but
I think,
I'll agree with that.
I think if you're doing a practice that you know, a management practice that increases carbon stocking, you're probably going to be in the forest management business.
Don, go ahead.
Thank you. I just had two questions and one observation. The questions are, how would this proposal affect parcels that are currently enrolled in open space? And also, does anybody know how many acres currently enrolled in open space are non-forest lands? Because I know there are places that are in open space because of the views, their fields or whatnot down along the coast. So, you know, how might this affect them? And my comment is that this is, again, one of these areas where there should be some estimate of the cost, reimbursement to municipalities, and also the issue of, you know, in terms of equity analysis, what kind of tax shifts are going to happen and the impacts on people and municipalities.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dana, go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. So a couple things, and appreciate all the work that Tom and the rest of the group have done on this. I think thinking big picture, and it's in line with what I made for comments on the RFP process. I think we want to make sure surgically, if any changes are made in open space, that they are in alignment with what potentially might come out of that RFP or a program that might be created in the future. Because obviously we don't want to create is are policies that are in conflict with one another or that create further regulations, probably not the right term, but requirements that might be above and beyond or inconsistent with what might be proposed in some type of a voluntary program, if you follow me. We want to make it as simple as possible so that if a landowner wants to be in open space and they also want to comply with a potential voluntary forest carbon market, there are some similarities between the two, so there's not duplication. Make it as simple as possible. That would be one, so that consistency is there. I'm concerned, like Patrick, with the harvest piece. I think, you know, and again, it goes back to the comment I just make, having a potential, and again, I know these aren't prescriptive, Tom, of a 10-year landowner commitment to allow carbon sequestration without a timber harvest. I think there needs to be something that goes to the allowable harvest that's consistent with the carbon markets, and basically just saying a landowner is not going to cut any wood for 10 years. I'm not so sure that's a good path forward. And then lastly, I think verification is key in all of this. So how is it verified? You know, the consulting forester has always obviously been the verification piece for tree growth, but you know, not all consulting foresters are going to make sure that they verify what has actually been done. They're going to sign off on it, get another 10-year plan in place, and the landowner is there. So I'd say there has to be some kind of a verification process that verifies what is being done on the ground, that goes above and beyond what's currently done now.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest that Tom Doak, do you feel like you took fairly good notes on comments that you heard today, or do you?
I've got some, but yeah, if you can help me, that'd be great.
I will do that, and then if the subgroup could reconvene and make, you know, one further set of modifications to bring back to the group for the next meeting, that would be great. Okay, let's pivot to the next item because this is meaty as well. Each one of these topics today really has been. I want to turn it over to Adam and have him sort of give a high-level overview of what was presented in the packet and sort of focus, Adam, if you would, on the areas of, you know, the issues that you really need feedback on. I'm not seeing your face, but I'm assuming you're still with us and that your camera's off. Great. And you're
every time I get low bandwidth, the camera automatically turns off, but I'm in here listening attentively.
Okay, so there are a number of us who are part of this subgroup, which is basically the language, just to be clear, is to basically look at task I, and that is to essentially recommend a numeric goal or targets for increased carbon sequestration in Maine over time. All right, so the first aspect is what do we mean by target, right? So, and there's a lot of ways that you can, interpret this, but basically in some way there's a numerical value that we have to put somewhere, right? So the discussion that we had is, does target mean specific amount of tons of greenhouse gas, sequestered, right? So is it 5 tons CO2 equivalent, million tons CO2 equivalent per year? Or is the target more to get a certain amount of landowners implementing practices that can increase carbon sequestration? Or is it a mix of the both of both? And I'm not, we didn't really come to convergence on that except for acknowledging that there's a broad perspective that you can think of there. The other discussion is, who does this target apply to? So again, the executive order didn't say that it applies to 10 to 10,000 acres, or does it apply to all of Maine? As a group, we mostly interpreted it as the 10 to 10,000 acre group, because that's what many of the other tasks are focused on. But then again, that's another thing that probably needs, whether or not our interpretation is actually aligned with what the governor's intent was when she wrote the executive order could probably be clarified. And so with that, this comes on with the comment that Don raised about, well, look at previous studies, try to figure out, what can actually be done, and quantitatively, can we even figure out what these targets should mean, right, based on different practices that could be applied in Maine. So what we have been doing myself along with Logan Woodyard, who, as you recall from the last meeting, is the one of my master's students who's working on this as part of her research and also interning with GoPIF. So she has been basically doing a extensive literature review on sort of any quantitative, any practices, sort of studies that have followed sort of different management practices that have been undertaken largely in Maine or northern New England, and sort of what are we assessing in terms of the sort of amount of tons per acre per year can be sequestered. And we're focusing mostly on this tons per acre per year, because all the studies focus on different time paths, different study areas, et cetera, right? And so we can at least maybe get a gauge of what's feasible out on the landscape, right? Are we talking about a bunch of practices that are going to get you 4 tons per year, or a bunch of practices that are going to get you, a quarter of a ton per year? And so those types of things are going to help us identify really what's feasible in terms of a value. And so I guess the only other thing that I sort of wanted to raise, and if I have the ability to share my screen, is just sort of the interpretation of sort of where things are going in Maine, and this discussion on we also had about, are forests doing enough, or where are the forests heading, right? Because this comes on one of Ivan's comments where he's talking about the temporal aspect of this. And so let me share my screen first, which should help me sort of get into this discussion of what we mean by target. So hopefully people now can see sort of this trajectory of what greenhouse gases have looked like in Maine, and then what the target, basically what the goals are looking for. Can someone give me a thumbs up or a nod?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So just to interpret this quickly, the green line, dark green line, is the gross greenhouse gas emissions from sort of industrial, residential, transportation sector. All right, but it does not include any of the biomass-based emissions, which Stacy can touch upon later in terms of how Maine might be doing some of their emissions measurements and tracking in the future. But the greenish line here, the light green line, is the target to basically be 2050 goal of 80% below 1990. All right. That has nothing to do with forest carbon sequestration. The part we're interested about is getting from this green line down to the red dot, right? That's the 2045 goal of being basically net zero by 2045. But the interesting thing there is that there's at least 2 or 3 interim goals on the greenhouse, the gross removal. There's actually no interim goal at all except for 2045. So you could actually think about not really having to do, we could cut all our forest down today and then actually let it grow back. And in theory, that's going to get us more sequestration than doing other things by that 2045 goal. So it's just kind of interesting. Our interpretation is try to maintain or increase sequestration rates based on today. But I'm just kind of noting that out there that you can actually think about different interpretations of what the trajectory could look like. So to get at what exactly we're doing today, what I've done is basically looked at a couple of sort of different sources that have looked at sort of the state of where forest carbon sequestration is in Maine, right, to help us think about where we're going. All right, so what we can interpret here is that basically the Forest Service every year updates their annual carbon sequestration flux. And they basically sort of smooth it over time, but which is why these basically red lines look relatively smooth. All right, and what we can do is we can compare that to the basically historical greenhouse gas emissions, which were in the green line before, and we can do the blue line minus the red line. So the red line is the amount of sequestration that's happening year on year. That's the additional amount of carbon that's being sequestered in our forests compared to the previous year. And because it's below zero, that means that we have net sequestration, or the flux is negative from that perspective. So that's what you want. You want this line to be as low as possible, as negative as possible. So do basically the sum of the blue line and the red line gets you the green line. So the interesting thing is in the last year, the Forest Service, for some reason, US Forest Service has changed their methods of how they estimate sequestration. And so as a result, Maine is actually, based on their analysis, has basically lost 3 million tons just in their methodology. We're still trying to figure out exactly what they've done to change that. But it's just one thing to note that when you get in the accounting world and setting targets and all this, there's things that can shift that we, that basically are important in terms of determining what that goal may be. But the reason I'm kind of doing all this is sort of saying, if this blue line is where sort of the goal is for Maine to be in terms of 80% below 1990 numbers in terms of gross emissions by 2050, then that means, if we hold what we have historically done over the last few years into perpetuity, Maine in theory could be carbon neutral somewhere between 2024 and 2030. If you actually also count the biomass emissions, which is here, this is basically saying this is the amount that's being also emitted by using biomass in various forms of industrial processes, et cetera. All right, that actually gets our number out to 2041, right? So that's another way to think. So it's all this different accounting stuff. And I know this looks confusing, but that's kind of the point, is that there's lots of ways that we can set targets, and even thinking about what we're measuring and what's included in that can have a huge effect on basically reaching our goals. Mm-hmm. It also suggests that basically, we may not, in an ideal world, we might be able to get away with just holding forests, using forests as the current state they are and towing the line. But if you look back, historically, when we were cutting more, right, and recovering from spruce budworm, the amount of sequestration was a lot lower than it is today. So it's just all these things to get the context of sort of what trajectory do we want to be on, and things that we need to at least consider. And so with that, the last thing I just want to point out is that we've then, based on this lit review, is we've come and try to identify basically what's out there in the literature, what it suggests amount of sequestration we can get by doing different practices across the landscape. And so to date, we found about 61 different estimates that apply to sort of northern New England. All right. And they're saying on average, you're getting somewhere along the lines of, 0.25 to half, maybe a quarter to a half a ton per acre per year is what you can get above and beyond sort of baseline practices. Mm-hmm. So we might be able to also use that to just, multiply that out by whatever acreage we want to sort of target. And that might also help us at least get an idea about where to go from here. There's still a lot more work to do, but it's at least some starting points about, do you want to set a specific target, which can be hard by saying we want 2 million tons? Would we rather want to set about a number of acres that are doing certain practices? And then it ties back to how do you actually get that done too, right? So you might want to think when setting the target about sort of realistic expectations, which comes back to a lot of things that Don was raising in terms of how do you summarize this type of practices and focus that we want to place.
That makes sense. So if you could stop screen share. Thank you so much for walking us through that in detail. Super helpful. I think it would be good to take question 2 on page 31, this who does the target apply to, and talk about that amongst you. Let me take Alec, you first. Go ahead. You're muted.
Adam, could you go back to that last histogram? You don't need to show it again, but just kind of talk me through what you were saying as to what the additional potential is according to the stuff that you've done.
Yeah, so we've tried to take a number of studies, including stuff that you've sent, Alec, and we've distilled that into a, over the lifetime of whatever study, which are all in different periods, but largely are between 20 and 100 years. What is the average sequestration rate occurring on whatever landscape or stand that study was conducted? We found that the range is between, sometimes they're net positive in terms of they emit more than a business as usual, and or they can get upwards of over a ton per acre per year. But on average, we're seeing around the sort of the peak of the histogram is getting roughly along the lines of
quarter ton to a half ton.
Yeah, quarter ton to a half ton. All right, but that's all the practices. The next thing is to identify which practices can get you more on a per acre basis, or coming back to Don's point, which ones are the most cost effective, right? Most of the studies beyond the stuff that I've done do not have a lot about the cost and effectiveness. So that's another limitation that we're finding. Generally, these practices are are probably going to be in line with the stuff that we've done to date and stuff we're going to do in the future. But that's another limitation.
So before, I just want to make sure, Alec, what you're asking is going to be at a high enough level that it's worthy of our last 15 minutes of meeting time.
I can talk to Adam separately.
I think so. Okay, good. So I do think it's important to get your collective feedback on question number 2 on page 31, and to see whether you are of a common perspective or not on what should this subgroup be doing. Should it be focused on a goal for the state as a whole? Is that how you're interpreting it? Or even if, I think we can agree that the executive order could be interpreted in different ways. What is going to be the most useful focus for this subgroup for the state? And should you stick to your knitting and only have a goal be on the 10 to 10,000 acre landowner group, or should it be a goal that aligns with the state greenhouse state climate goals? Feedback on that. I know that you had a fairly substantive conversation about that at the subgroup level. I don't want to recreate it, but I do think there's a lack of alignment right currently between perhaps what the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future is thinking that we're doing and what this group has been thinking its charge was. Patrick, go ahead. You're muted.
What a rookie, huh? I'm of the strong belief that this group is charged with the 10 to 10,000 acre task. And I think if you expand it beyond that, we're going to have a huge discussion. So that's just kind of my my perspective on it. Stick to
Thank you.
knitting.
Don, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Patrick on that. And I would further suggest that we can do a lot more when we target the under 5,000 acre class, and particularly the under 1,000 acre class, because we do collect information or refined information on those ownership classes at our level. And our programs are, even our federal programs are designed to serve those people. And as Patrick said earlier today, there's only a handful of landowners who own between 5,000 and 10,000 acres.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Karen, go ahead.
I agree that it should be for the 10,000 acre less group. I feel that we would want to have a lot more information about other size acreages before I'd feel comfortable knowing how to set a target. And our entire process has been focused on the 10,000 or less.
Okay. Anybody feel differently, just so that we can finish this piece? All right. So then I think it does suggest that, perhaps the expectation that GoPIF had, we can, work with them to figure out a way to help them get the information that they need that's relevant to the entire state, but that it wasn't an understanding that would be this group's charge. I mean, I will note that Mark is not present today, and I think he's been a proponent of suggesting that that to align most clearly with state objectives, it would be logical to have a state goal. And he's not here to advocate for that himself today, but for the moment, we'll put that conversation aside. Karen, and then we'll move on. Go ahead.
I mean, if Mark wanted to make a proposal that a recommendation would be that be taken up by some, that would be another way to approach his concern.
Right.
Or,
Great. Okay. So then the other question that's part of this is what do we mean by target? And I think it would be helpful to get a general sense from this group to provide feedback to the subgroup of whether we're talking about a number of tons or a suite of practices. And what was those of you who were not on the subcommittee, what was your sense of what where this subgroup ought to be headed? We need to be able to give them some feedback. If there are not further thoughts from those who weren't on the subcommittee, was there a leaning one way or another within the subcommittee, Adam?
Yeah, my recollection is the leaning was more focusing on targets or sort of uptake in terms of not targets, but practices in terms of implementation side. It'd be easier to monitor, probably be easier to direct. And it still seems like there's high uncertainty around the accounting and things like that in terms of being like, oh yeah, we definitely know that we're starting at, small landowners are definitely starting at a base of 3 million tons per acre. And so therefore we think that we can get to 4.5. That level of uncertainty is, I think, still too high now, but people could feel more confident around trying to target and say, by this year, get 25% more or X number of owners or something enrolled or something in some practice or in some program or doing some practice or something like that. You can obviously have an alignment of this is expectation that if they do that, it will roughly get between X and Y tons, right? But it might be easier to focus on that from an implementation perspective.
Thank you. Stacy?
Yeah, I was not on that subcommittee, but I strongly agree with that approach. Mostly for engagement purposes, I think the public does not know what a ton of carbon means, but they do know what X, Y, and Z practices mean. And so they can wrap their head around that and feel like they're contributing and doing good. I feel like it's a target that the general public can understand better.
Okay, well, so barring any major objection to that, in the interest of time, I would suggest that the subgroup continue its work with those two pieces of understanding, that it's focused on a suite of practices and that it's focused on that the target is for 10 to 10,000 acre ownerships, and that we move on. So where we're at, thank you all for continuing your work on that. I'll follow up with you, Adam, and frankly, Adam and Don, I'll be following up with you because I think I'll be needing your assistance in drafting introductory paragraphs to those two tables as well in the main document. So let me jump over the review of the executive order. Let me see who has would like to raise their hand for public comment. And if you could do that while Doug, why don't we take you? I know that you have, and just Doug, if you could tell me if you saw my chat to you. And you're not off mute. So while you're working on that, Doug, why don't I take?
I don't think I did.
Okay. What I said to you, Doug, was that I did share your 8-page letter with the co-chairs right before I left for vacation.
Oh, I missed. Okay.
And given the short time that we have for public comment, I just wanted to suggest that you highlight a few major points from your memo to share with the group, because there wouldn't be time for, obviously a reading of that.
That would be fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
From a perspective of somebody who owns a small woodlot or several small ones, and being the only one here, my biggest concern in terms of a program being private, not government, whether it's RFP or not, is that I would be scared to enroll in such a program. 25-year, 30-year term, being a small, not being a major woodland owner, just being a small one, I would have no recourse. If the program went corrupt or failed or arbitrarily dropped me, and I think I'm speaking for a huge number of small woodland owners, I don't see any security in this. I also am really dubious about whether a program would adhere to sufficient additionality. I mean, from my perspective, why sign up if this isn't going to do the cause of carbon sequestration a lot of good? My reason for supporting a government involvement, state government involvement, is that that would be a way to keep a private program honest. If the state maintained monitoring involvement throughout the entire term for each enrollee, I think it's reasonable for people who own small woodlots who don't have a lot of financial resources to be scared of something where there's no guarantee. Secondly, I'm 100% with Ivan and Karen. We don't have much time, and 2025 is indeed far more important than 2045. If we start going then, it's going to be way too late. I know some of you read the facts, the statistics about Canada, about the Amazon basin. No longer are they carbon sequesterers. There's no reason why the same thing wouldn't happen to us if we didn't get on the ball. I think that Pat was right in one thing, that we need to focus on the 20 to 10,000 acre folk. And the needs are really different in many ways from the forest products industry. And that I'm sorry, Patrick, but I resent the amount of effort that you put into pouring a wet blanket over so much of what other people are suggesting or raising. And for you, Amanda and Tom, I wish to heck that you could show a little color of money here about, not leaving us in the dark as to whether nothing's acceptable or a modest amount of money towards it's acceptable or what. I think it has to be government involvement. A private management with government scrutiny throughout the term may work very well. In other words, government wouldn't be saddled with running it, but it would sure be there to make sure that it works right. If that makes any sense. We're really, I'm repeating myself. We just need to get going here. And this task force all along has been riven by political and ideological differences that have really gotten in the way. I don't know what the solution is, but I just wish that people would think more about where do we want our forest to be 10 years, 30 years, 50 years. And again, Pat, I think you're wrong if you think that we can just do business as usual throughout the rest of this century, as far as growing forests with the 50-year rotations and all that. Sequestration is important. Storage is just as important. That's why the need for some of the forests to be allowed to grow larger, older, higher quality, mature trees. And thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you, Doug. Tracy, go right ahead.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to mention a couple of things. First, on the question of why should the state role be there? I think to me it's real simple. The state should have a role. The only reason really for the state to have a role is to increase landowner participation, or to increase the price and value of carbon, and to bring in other states to make it move toward that regional position. And I think some leadership by Maine will help bring those other states along. It has in other areas. There's no reason it wouldn't in this case. What the state role should be, I really think that's one of the best attributes of the RFP. The RFP sort of is asking people for what should the state role be, and specifically for what should the state role be in order to increase landowner participation, increase price, grow it to other states. I'm just going to mention the open space law because that's a good example of there's a number of things that states can do that nobody else but the state can do. And one of those things would be amending the open space law. So, we're sort of asking the business community out there that runs, creates, works with these programs, what can the state do, including things like amending the open space law that would help increase landowner participation, increase the price, and help spread it to other states. So I think you guys have done a lot of great work. You're on the right track. I think I'm hoping you and we will all be surprised at the creative and productive things that might come forward from the RFP process. So thanks a lot for your work.
Thank you, Tracy. So we're out of time, but I think we're also at the end of our agenda. And I think I'd keep you on for one last minute to say, Amanda and Tom Gordon and I did have a brief conversation about whether it would make sense to extend this deadline at all. Not to give us 6 more months, not to give us a lot of time to take on another chunk of work, but would we produce a better product by moving the deadline 1 or 2 months? I don't want to get comment on that right now, but I think that if you had perspectives on that you wanted to share by email, feel free to do that. At the moment, please assume that our final 2 meetings are August 6th and August 20th from 9 till noon by Zoom. And one of the things that Amanda and Tom and I will be thinking about is there a need for any other process of public comment, public input into a draft set of recommendations, or could that be accomplished through these 2 meetings? So with that, we'll finish up, and I'm going to be following up with many of you after the meeting. But thank you so much for your time.